Okay, we're live on YouTube with Glenn Kirschner. He just told me right before I hit go live that you're pretty nervous about going live in front of my 4,000, 3,000 some subscribers. You have 1 million subscribers, but I don't feel like you go live. So you must be pretty nervous. You go live on TV, but this is probably the highest point for you.
Yeah, I assumed you would have dozens of followers, Pete. But no, I've been going live every night on Substack. Actually, I just
Oh,
started on Substack not too long ago. So and it's very liberating. I mean, it's just fun to talk about the legal issues of the day, watch the comments scroll, try to answer questions. So yeah, I'm really digging that. I enjoy being 100% independent, having left MSNBC a few months ago.
you did a whole thing video and you've talked a lot about it, but just in case people don't know, why did you leave MSNBC? Has it proven to be a right decision?
I think it is the right decision. I am extremely frustrated at mainstream media, corporate media, legacy media, because they keep covering Trump the same old way. They just kind of regurgitate whatever it is he says, kind of uncritically and unthinkingly. If I hear one more anchor on any of the cable news networks say, well, the president just said X, Y, and Z. Yeah, but that doesn't mean shit because he lies all day, every day. So I was frustrated with corporate media, decided to go independent. And I also really wanted to try to talk across the great divide, listen across the great divide, talk about the rule of law and the importance of the rule of law to a healthy democracy to all kinds of audiences. And, I had the opportunity to speak at a Republican conference not too long ago. I'm trying to get on some of the sort of center right networks. I've been getting a good number of pipe bomb threats as a result, which is, not fun. But
You've seen the amount of threats go up since you started going on different programs?
certainly since I spoke at the Republican Principles First Summit in DC, bomb threats came in that day, and there was a list of the people who, quote, deserve to die. And I was one of the 12 or so listed, and have had other pipe bomb threats come in after that. So, but, listen, I was followed by an actual hitman when I was a homicide prosecutor and a RICO prosecutor. So, not that I want to be cavalier about these threats, but I take some comfort in knowing that a pipe bomb has never gone off in a mailbox, even though calls are placed, hundreds of times a day by these knuckleheads.
Does it bring you any comfort to know that, you and I are pretty good friends? Does it bring you any comfort to know that they'd have to go through me first?
Minimal comfort, Pete. Minimal. Yeah, you're like the tiniest human shield imaginable.
It's like, if you're going to get the cursor, you've got to go through me. Okay. All right, then. All right. Well, there's a lot of legal issues to talk with you about, but I'm excited that you're going live on Substack. That's cool. And I'm excited you're taking, comments and questions in real time over there. You talk about rule of law. You talk about habeas corpus and due process. Enough with you legal experts and your bullshit legal lingo. It was all this save democracy stuff. I realized recently no one knows what those words mean because we've always had them or some semblance of them. When you talk about the rule of law, talk about saving democracy, talk about even justice, I think we need to do an even better job at dumbing it down. So my question to you is, how do you explain due process to someone who's not worried about being kidnapped?
Yeah. So, in the context of the federal government trying to do something to you, grab you up, send you somewhere, due process involves just two things: notice of what the government's going to try to do to you before they do it. And once they give you notice, you have an opportunity to be heard in court, period. Plain and simple. Good example of it. Just yesterday, a judge shot down the Trump administration DOJ lawyer saying, fine, if we have to give due process to these immigrants we're trying to deport to El Salvador and imprison down there on taxpayers' dollars, we'll give 24 hours notice. And if they don't contest it, we're sticking them on a plane and shipping them overseas to a prison. And the judge said, are you flipping kidding me? That's not exactly the way the judge put it. But the judge said, no, I am ruling that you will give immigrants a minimum of 21 days advance notice before you try to deport anybody. And they must understand what their rights are. They must understand they have a right to a lawyer. They must understand they have a right to go into court and exercise their constitutional opportunity to be heard and say, for example, no, Trump administration, this is not a gang tattoo. It's a soccer tattoo. That's why we have due process. That's why before our government acts against us, Pete, we have a right to be told what they're going to try to do, and we get to contest it in court with the assistance of a lawyer. That's due process in the immigration deportation context.
You're saying don't American citizens have more rights than undocumented people who are here, quote, illegally?
Well, more rights in the sense that we can't be deported. There's no basis to deport us. But no, everybody who has their feet on American soil has some basic constitutional rights. Because if they didn't, the government could just go around and start kidnapping everybody left and right, sending them to Lord knows where, or falsely imprisoning them with no process at all. So no, if you're on our soil, God damn it, this is America, you're going to have some basic rights before the government can act against you.
One of the big issues around immigration reform, or one of the big inputs or changes that need to be made, both in 2010 and then the recent one that was killed by Trump, was more immigration courts, more immigration judges, more resources directed towards courts that can determine all of these issues around citizenship and whether or not you committed a crime and whether or not you get to stay or you got to leave. Of course, that immigration reform was never passed. So the Trump administration is either learning for the first time or they knew, and they're trying to get around the fact that there are not enough courts and judges. So there's a backlog of people here who are trying to get, quote, due process, have a hearing about their status. But the line is very, very long. So instead, they're just throwing all of the justice away and just saying, these people, you're gone. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you do have that right. So you know what? Hire more judges, right? It's no excuse that I'm going to violate the constitutional rights of people because we don't have the resources to honor their constitutional rights. That's not the way it works. And, you know, it's funny because Trump posted, I think yesterday, that it's impossible to give hundreds of thousands of immigrants a trial before we deport them. I wanted, you know, I wish some third-rate DOJ lawyer would walk in and say, Mr. President, listen, you have a fundamental misunderstanding of what a deportation hearing looks like, and we understand why you have a fundamental misunderstanding. You were actually criminally prosecuted in a trial, which admittedly is a very long, drawn-out, extended, arduous process, starting with a grand jury and then an indictment, and then you fought your case tooth and nail with lots of motions to dismiss. But because the evidence was so strong against you, Mr. President, the judge denied your motions. Then you had a long jury selection process. Then you had a trial. Then you had deliberations, and the New York jury convicted you in a New York minute. So you have that frame of reference. That's your frame of reference, Mr. President. That's not the way a deportation hearing goes. You get notice and opportunity to be heard. And if you're so confident that the people that you're summarily claiming are dangerous gang members and should be deported, if you're so confident that you have the evidence to back that up, then let's use the constitutional processes in place and then deport them. Pete, listen, I prosecuted a lot of very, very dangerous people. I was a homicide prosecutor in DC for 22 years, but I was never allowed to say, you know what, because they're dangerous people, because maybe some of them are gang members, I'm not going to honor their constitutional rights. I gave them all of their constitutional rights and then some.
Let's just take that a step back. I mean, you were a federal prosecutor. You dealt with all of the worst, all of the bad people. But it just occurs to me that it never occurred to you and your colleagues, no matter where they were on the spectrum of politics or legality, that this person is clearly guilty. They've admitted guilt. We know all of the evidence against them. They don't deserve a trial. You prepared for the trial, and there's some kind of reverence around the justice system that required you to do so, even when you knew in your heart of hearts that someone was guilty. How am I saying? You'll say it much better than I do.
Yeah, Pete, I would never say they don't deserve a trial. I would say every single one of them do deserve a trial. And they deserve not only due process, which in the context of a criminal trial involves a whole heck of a lot, soup to nuts, but they also deserve, under the Sixth Amendment right to counsel, zealous, unconflicted representation. The entire federal government, the federal prosecution, is prosecuting this person. Look at the caption of the case: United States of America versus Pete Dominick, because you're alleged to have committed a crime. Doesn't seem like a fair fight. So the least you can expect is zealous representation from unconflicted counsel. And you know why I so respect, admire, and honor the work criminal defense attorneys do, Pete? Because, as a prosecutor, I had one job. It was to, assess the evidence, marshal the evidence. If it warranted an indictment and a trial, proceed to the indictment and the trial. But you know what criminal defense attorneys have to do? They have to not only zealously represent the interests of their client at trial, they have to act as a check on governmental abuse and overreach and misconduct, right? Man, they're doing double duty. And that's why I will always give huge props to criminal defense attorneys, because they're the ones who keep the police, the prosecutors, and the judges honest.
I saw Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz, the great Ted Cruz. You like him?
Not so much.
Oh, I like him. I think he's great. He seems great. He was the other day, smart guy, went to Harvard. I don't know if you knew that. Con law guy, knows his stuff, and doesn't care about anybody, including his own family. Nonetheless, smart guy. He basically said that Donald Trump and his administration has had more court injunctions against him than any president ever. And they were like 34. And that was like last week. It's probably no more. Explain what that means and why it matters, and why, in this case, Senator Ted Cruz is making a bad point.
Yeah. Now, he's making the perfect point. And the takeaway is Trump and his administration have engaged in more lawlessness and unconstitutional conduct than anybody thought was possible from a president of the United States and his administration. Pete, I can't count how many people I prosecuted. I always try to do it fairly and in accordance with the rule of law and the Constitution. But I never had a defendant say, Your Honor, I've got 30 criminal convictions. They're out to get me. Yes, we're out to get you because you committed 30 crimes. We're out to get Donald Trump because he is a nonstop crime wave. That's what he is. Pete, he's sitting in the Oval Office signing unconstitutional executive order, one after another. And judges, including some of our longest serving federal judges appointed by Ronald Reagan, are saying to him, what you've done is, quote, blatantly unconstitutional. Judge Harvey Wilkinson, appointed by Ronald Reagan, recently said what he's doing by trying to deport people without honoring their constitutional due process rights. If he can do it to them, he can do it to American citizens next, and then he can do it to his political opponents. These are judges, stalwart Republican conservative judges, one after another. That's because Trump is engaged in unabated lawlessness and unconstitutionality. It's not because the system is out to get him.
Is there any case? Let's get into this. There's some of these cases that you think is more outrageous and more egregious than any other, because there's so many. It's hard to pick from, and it's hard to keep track of.
Yeah, it is hard. The fact that he is extorting law firms to try to shut them down and shut them out, and that half of them are bending the knee and giving in. I don't know why any client would ever want to be represented by a law firm that can't even defend itself and zealously represent its own rights not to be extorted by a corrupt president. But that's horrific, because every law firm that bends a knee is making our job fighting for democracy all the harder. because you're feeding the monster. You got to starve the monster. You can't feed the monster because the monster will remain hungry and get hungrier.
Right.
And, fortunately, we've had lots of universities stand up against his attempts to overtake institutions of higher education, which is just this bizarre dictatorial appetite he has. But now, hundreds of universities are banding together and saying no. Lots of law firms are banding together and saying no. And most importantly, the federal courts are holding strong. The next step is we're going to see lots of contempt proceedings. And I suspect we're even going to see Trump administration officials being put behind bars until they purge. I do think so. I think it's going to come to that. And these DOJ lawyers, Pete, let me use today's ruling in connection with the Abrego Garcia case.
Yeah, what's the
latest? Today, Paula Sinis, which is finally, we've learned the correct pronunciation of her name. Judge Paula Sinis said today in an 8-page ruling that the Trump administration, the DOJ lawyers are providing, quote, falsehoods and, quote, acting in willful bad faith in violating her orders, her discovery orders that she's put in place. What people should understand, Pete, is those are career-ending rulings for Department of Justice lawyers. Certainly in a time when the leadership of the Department of Justice was honest and ethical and cared about the rule of law and their oath to the Constitution, which is not the case now with, the consiglieres of Pam Bondi and Todd Blanche and Emile Beauvais who are in place. Ordinarily, those are career-ending determinations, because here's what happens. And people should know this because there is light out there on the horizon. There are points of light. Now that those findings have been made by a federal court judge, these attorneys who are going in there presenting falsehoods and engaging in willful bad faith will be referred to their state bar counsel, because every federal lawyer has a state bar license. That's how it works. You go to law school, you graduate, you pass the bar, you take a bar exam in your state of residence. And once you pass the bar exam of your state, you can practice in all federal courts across the country. That's the way it works when you're a DOJ lawyer. But you are still beholden to your state bar. And the good news is these lawyers will have to be referred for ethics investigations to their state bars. Think Rudy Giuliani. He was disbarred in both New York and Washington, D.C., because he held law licenses in both jurisdictions. So all of this is still going to be in the hands of the states, beyond the reach of Donald Trump and his dirty actors. So there is some hope as long as we don't, give in to the hopelessness.
Well, I agree with that fully, but my understanding, which is limited on such things, is that even if someone was held in contempt and, as you said, could go to jail, it's the purview of the Department of Justice, helmed by Pam Bondi, and she controls the marshals that would be she could then go order the marshals to let them out of jail. Like, is that not the case, that the Department of Justice is in charge of who goes to jail and who gets out?
Yes, she can act lawlessly. And if she ordered the U.S. Marshals to not execute federal court orders, including to take someone into custody who's been found in criminal contempt, she would be directly violating the federal law. For anybody scoring at home, 28 United States Code 566C, Charlie, says the U.S. Marshals shall, mandatory, execute all federal court orders and shall commandeer resources necessary to do so. That's the federal law. So yes, Pam Bondi, as Attorney General, can order them to act lawlessly, criminally, in violation of the federal law. That could happen. I know the U.S. Marshals. I worked with them for decades. I don't think they'll take kindly to being told they must commit federal crimes because Pam Bondi told them to. I can't predict how all that's going to shake out, but you know what? My money's on the Marshals, not on Pam Bondi.
All right. If you say so, you have a lot better judgment of.
Not to mention, Pete, when it comes to criminal contempt of a federal judge's court order, DOJ can say, we're not prosecuting that. But guess what? That is the one and only crime where a judge can appoint an independent prosecutor to prosecute the violation of the judge's court order. Because if they couldn't, the judges would be the judiciary, a co-equal branch of government, would be completely at the whim and the will of the executive branch, the Department of Justice. So that, again, is a point of light to hold on to. And I suspect we're going to see some independent prosecutors appointed before this is all over.
After the election, you, just like the rest of us, and you being one of our fearless leaders, were crestfallen, depressed, sad, enraged at the outcome of the election, though didn't challenge it. I was surprised you did not lead a revolt on the Capitol, because we would have followed you. I would have followed you right up to wherever you could tell me, go in there, and then be like, oh, that's a McDonald's. I'm like, just give me a burger. But I would do anything you told me. But we didn't do that. We accepted the outcome of the election. We were really upset. It seems, maybe I'm wrong, but that you, like many other people who are specialists, who are experts on the justice system, are seeing some reason to be, I don't know what the words I want to say, the worm is turned, slightly inspired by the fact that the courts have held up in many ways. You've got a great video. You interviewed Congressman Jake Auchincloss. Am I saying that right? He's a smart.
Auchincloss. He's terrific. Yeah, he's a dynamic young legislator.
Yeah. The courts are upholding the rule of law is the title of that one. And there's others, videos at your YouTube and at your Substack. You've been talking about this. Am I right to interpret that you are feeling, and it sounds like even in this conversation, slightly inspired or positive or better that the rule of law seems to be holding a bit?
Yeah, I'm bullish on the rule of law. I don't think it's dead. I think Donald Trump is trying to walk the rule of law deep into the woods and shoot it dead, but he has not succeeded yet. I don't think he will succeed. The more lawless conduct he engages in, and certainly if he begins to openly and repeatedly defy court orders, he will lose the Supreme Court. And here's the thing, Pete. Once he makes the decision to end our constitutional construct of government, right, and he refuses to recognize the authority of the judicial branch of government, having the Supreme Court, which is entitled to, call constitutional balls and strikes. Once he tries to end the constitutional construct of government, I don't think that is sustainable for any number of reasons. I think he begins to alienate more and more people and organizations and populations. He's certainly galvanized world opinion and consensus against the United States, at least temporarily. So, then what he will have left is might makes right. And I got the military and the Supreme Court and the judicial branch and the legislative branch don't. So what you going to do now? This is where I have to fall back on my Army days, Pete. I went through both officer basic training, and then I went to the Army's JAG school before I began practicing as an Army JAG prosecutor. And this was back in the 80s. And what we have drilled into our heads, and it's not just an officer basic, it's enlisted, it's everybody drilled into our heads. We must disobey unlawful orders.
Really? They drill that?
Must. We are required to. You look at the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is the criminal code, the criminal statutes that under which we operate in the military. It says you must obey a lawful order, but you have a duty to disobey unlawful orders. If your platoon sergeant or your platoon leader, your platoon lieutenant says, kill that civilian, do you think we have to obey that order? Well, Donald Trump, if push comes to shove, may order the military to kill democracy. I don't believe they're going to do it. I don't believe they're going to do it.
What are you looking for in terms of threshold changing, paradigm changing events? The Supreme Court decision, the highest court in the land deciding this or that, or something else that the administration boldly does? What are you looking for?
I don't know that there's going to be one event. I do think that the Republicans in Congress, stay with me here, because I know what our gut reaction is when we, want to rely on the Republicans in Congress to do anything. When you think about the last time we had to fight to save the Republic, obviously long before we were born, right? People are carrying, muskets and marching onto fields, and they're risking life and limb, and it's brother on brother violence. And it's, that took real courage and real determination to try to save the Republic. And they did. Today, Pete, the only thing the Republicans in Congress have to do to save our democracy is cross the aisle. cross the aisle to save our democracy. I know, like Senator Murkowski said, we're scared. And I understand that. Just as the men on the battlefield during the Civil War were probably scared to death, and many ended up dying for the cause, an important cause, an all-important cause. So we understand you're scared, and I'm not belittling that. I'm not diminishing your fear. But all you have to do, you don't have to risk life and limb. You just have to cross the aisle and save democracy by voting this man out if he tries to end our constitutional construct of government.
Last question. I keep thinking about this. I asked my friend Eric Siegel earlier today. He's a constitutional law scholar. What's the difference between the rights and the trials and the, quote, due process, a phrase I try not to use because nobody knows what it means, given to suspected Al-Qaeda terrorists and supporters of Al-Qaeda during the, quote, war on terror? I paid real close attention to those Gitmo detainees, the legality around it, what Guantanamo Bay represented, and what rights they had. But they were accused, some of them at the highest levels, the worst levels, of plotting 9/11, carrying out 9/11, and others were accused of other attacks on American soldiers and so on. But what about what the Bush administration did to those guys, that those of us on the left and other people who are consistent about due process and the precedent and history of this country, you know, versus these people who may not have committed any crime except for, if you're going to say, staying here past their legal timelines or, you know, being here, quote, illegally, which I don't like to use. But that many
So Pete, I'm going to have to bounce in a second. I'm sorry, but let me try to answer that. First of all, I would want to go back and read up on the differences. But I remember from back in the day, what due process demands, the constitutional concept of due process, it depends on what, this is going to sound a little flippant, it depends on what judges rule due process requires in each individual situation. So when you're dealing with, for example, military tribunals, the system, the judiciary that is in place to handle that, and you know, in the Army we have military judges until you get up to the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, USACAF, and then there's a direct line of appeal up to the Supreme Court. But there are different rules for different systems and different detainees. So whatever due process is required is going to be up to the courts, trial courts, appellate courts, and ultimately the Supreme Court to delineate. And just as your trial due process rights are very involved, I'm not going to say they're endless, but they are, extremely fulsome, your due process rights. But in a deportation hearing, not the case. You're not going to have a jury trial. You're not going to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. You're not going to have the same processes that somebody's going to have in a traditional criminal trial. So it really depends. There's no one size fits all answer to what due process requires, because there are a lot of variables that can go into it.
Glenn Kirschner, I'll see you Friday. Very excited to see you at this great event that you've invited me to. And I hope everybody goes and subscribes to the Substack at Glenn Kirschner, of course, YouTube. Almost 1 million followers there. He's the king of all justice media. Thank you very much for joining us as always, my friend.
Great seeing you, Pete. I'll see you Friday.
There he goes. Hit the red X, and then I'm going to talk about you when you leave. There he goes. He's really out of here. He's in a hurry. I told him 20 minutes. I took 30. You're welcome, everybody. I'm going to hang out here for 4 hours taking any of your questions now. So fire away whatever you want to know about life, whatever you want to know about death or justice. I just like doing live events and then staying. It's like you had a party and everybody left, but you just stayed on. Like, hey guys, I'm still here. I'm still ready to party. Got nowhere to be. No, I gotta go. I've got a very important event right now that I've got to get to, honoring homeless veterans. No, I'm actually doing that on Friday night. Glenn invited me to the Purple and Gold Gala at the Army Navy Country Club in Arlington, Virginia. And I'm going to go there and I'm going to do a little bit, do a little like 3-minute, 5-minute speaking gig. So I'll see Glenn in Arlington, Virginia. If anybody's there and wants to hang out, I'm always like hanging out in Arlington. Yeah, I just need a guitar. What is the deal with airline food? I'm just reading the chat. All right, folks. Thank you very much for joining me. And this is it for today on the YouTube Live. Nothing else is booked, but this is going good. This is a fun experiment. So thanks to those of you who have joined. Okay. Bye-bye.